Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and a warm welcome to you all to this, our final live session to our second series of the Kyle Book Club. My name is Lisa Caulfield and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Center here in Kyle, and I would like to report that this day is a beautiful day here in Connemara. The ever-changing on the mountains has been beautiful, unlike the previous day that was where we had the remnants of a storm Francis. I'm delighted to update you all that our current number of registrations for the Kyle Book Club has reached our goal, I suppose, in the last 24 hours is 750 registered participants. So thank you all, representing 22 countries worldwide. Really appreciate the support for this, our venture. Normally, I take time to start each session with thanking our sponsors for the book club that have made this a reality and such a wonderful success. Today, I want to draw attention to a specific few who made this happen, and I'd like to draw attention to my colleagues at Notre Dame International, Father Bob Dowd, Zoe Langsdale, and Maggie Areola. I want to thank also people from the Keegan-Dolan Institute for Irish Studies, Mary Hendrickson and Catherine Wilsden. I want to also specifically thank Sonia Howell from Notre Dame Learning, and a special thanks to Mary Scott, Lee Valentine Barthuli, and of course Dolly Duffy from the Notre Dame Alumni Association, all of whom together with combined effort, this could not have been a reality. So I want to thank each and every one of you for helping this become a reality for us. I'm gonna just give you a kind of overview of what we'll do for the next hour. This format includes a 10-minute breakout session for those of you who are just joining us for the first time today. And our faculty have given us a couple questions. Declan's given us a couple questions to think out at the breakout, but this enables you in this 10-minute interval to get to know the other participants. I've really gotten some wonderful stories of what's happened in these breakout rooms, of people reuniting with former classmates and just meeting our former students or interns. So I've really been happy with how the group breakouts have worked out. But that being all said, if you do not wish to partake in the opportunity for the breakout and you feel that you'd just like to take those 10 minutes to yourself, then you do not have to choose to go into a breakout room, and you can choose to opt out of it. So do not feel that you necessarily need to go into a breakout session. You can sit quietly in the main room and wait for the group to be brought back in. And also, I want you to just, keep that civil discourse amongst friends in these breakout rooms, and that if you can please submit your questions in the Google chat form that we're sharing with you online for Professor Kybert or for our guest panelists today. It's in the chat form, and Zoe's sharing it in the chat function, and this will just help us to facilitate the questions and group them according to theme. Again, with every session, I find that we get so many questions for Declan that we can't get through in the whole hour. So if we don't get to your question in this hour, please submit them to us on the LinkedIn discussion board, or even thoughts that you had that we didn't get to for comments and things. We will address them in the LinkedIn discussion board. And that LinkedIn discussion board will continue to be moderated after this book club to give you continuing reading suggestions and other thoughts that we'd like to share as a cohort. So on behalf of Professor Declan Kybert today, I would like to welcome Michael Keegan-Dolan as our guest panelist this week to discuss the body and creative expression. Michal is an artist, director, writer, and choreographer who founded an Irish dance company in 2016, Teaĉ Daṁsa, as a means to forge deeper connections with Irish tradition, language, and music. His production of Swan Lake won the Irish Times Theatre Award in 2017 for Best New Production, and the UK Critics Circle National Dance Award for Best Production of 2018. In February of this year, he produced Mom, a new theatrical performance, which opened, I believe, the Dublin Theatre Festival, and has been hailed as revelatory by our good friend, Philip King. Bringing together contemporary dancers, traditional Irish music with Cormac Begley, who was who was playing the concertina, I may say, in this performance, and also recently played here at Keimer. Michael Keegan-Dolan brought together an avant-garde music collective from Germany as well, called Stargaze. Michael is currently an associate at Sadler's Well in London, and I want to warmly welcome him to today's live session and thank him for giving us his time. I will now call upon Declan to provide an overview of this week's topic and then discuss the topic with Michael. So Declan, take it away.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much, Michael, for your participation. It's not the first nor even the second. I think it's the third time you have favored Notre Dame and honored us with your presence. I shall never forget the first occasion when you came here to O'Connell House and jumped up on the students' tables and you leaped from one to another, landing on their jotters and notebooks, but leaving no trace, no imprint of your foot in order to demonstrate the art of perfect balance. And although those students are long gone, this is a kind of mythic moment in the history of Notre Dame. You are the Nijinsky of our tradition with that leap. We can't do it obviously on Zoom, but I also remember you saying on that day, as an example of how most Irish people are not at home in their bodies. Look at the way your professor, Declan, up there is slouching in his chair. So,
I'm so sorry.
No, it is an honor to be insulted by a man like you, sir. But can I ask you, do you think Irish people are more at home in their bodies these days than they were when you grew up?
Yes, without a doubt. Yes.
And why? What affected that change?
Where would you start? I suppose it takes time to recover from imposition. Yes. It's very difficult to talk about it because to simplify it doesn't do it service in some ways, but to get into the complexity of it would take months and months and years to discuss. But it must have something to do with the changes in the way we are dominated, are ruled, are controlled. Like I feel very strongly that as a people, we haven't fully recovered from the invasions of this, from starting with the Anglo-Saxons and then really, I guess, with Rome in some way, which ran our country in some way for a long time, and then with the capitalists, I suppose. But I think we're slowly recovering as a people, and in that process of recovery, we're becoming more at ease with who we are, and that leads then to an easier relationship with the vehicle with which you pass through this existence.
Yes, yeah. And we began in this course by talking about the body, not just as an image of the soul, but in particular about Joyce in 1922, celebrating the human body and its parts at the same moment of Irish liberation. So I see exactly the point you're making. Maybe we should go back a bit though. How did you get into all this? Because my memory of you in your earlier days was that you were a flying wing on the St. Paul's rugby team.
Yeah, I was very quick over about 50 meters back in the day. And it was it was a useful gift because I grew up at a time when even Clontarf, the suburb I grew up in, which is now quite affluent, was a fairly challenging place to exist if one had any sort of artistic nature. And so I had to run around the suburbs of Clontarf a lot to avoid violence, I suppose, from people who did not like the way I had my haircut. But I suppose the physicality that I inherited from my ancestors, my father was a very good footballer, made it possible for me to even consider making my living from dancing, which was a preposterous, ridiculous idea in St. Paul's College, Raheny in 1988. But the physical toughness, I suppose, I had inherited from my ancestors served me very well, because you can't have a career in dance or choreography unless you really can't, unless there's a kind of a physical tenacity and an ability to endure long hours of work.
I thought that most dancers were really foredestined to be dancers a few seconds after they exited the womb.
Yeah.
Or at least at the age of 5 or 6. But you're a kind of pretty late vocation in that sense, aren't you? You went from being a 17-year-old rugby player suddenly to becoming a dancer.
Yeah, but I think you're right, Declan. I think you are. I think, well, it does. I suppose when I hear myself say I think, I always hear the voice saying it doesn't matter what you think, Michael. But what I do think is that dancers are born. And I think, it's like in parts of India, they would see it as a caste, that it's a condition that you're born into. And I was born a dancer. I have no doubts about it. I just happened to be born in a part of the world that maybe didn't have the facility or the facilities to allow me to be what I was until I had enough kind of momentum and energy and kind of intellectual ability to say it and become it. Yeah. So I felt I was a dancer from the day I was born, but I did not take my first dance class until I was 17, simply because it just wasn't possible. It was beyond imagination, You have to imagine, like, river dance would not happen until, like, that was so I took my first dance class maybe in 1987. I think river dance was 1998. So it was a long time before the idea of making a living out of dancing was in our imagination in Ireland.
Yes, and you really had to go to England, didn't you?
Yes.
To pursue that dream.
And I still would today. And this is probably one of the sadder parts of the story. Today, if I wanted to become what I did become, I would still have to go away. So although we have become more at ease with ourselves and our relationships with our bodies, I'm afraid dancing, it has made great strides, but it still isn't at all where it could be. You cannot train. There's no conservatoire style training in Ireland still.
Do you offer classes yourself? I've heard that you teach people even breathing exercises as part of the process of becoming dancers.
Well, I think Peter Brook said it. If for anyone to become an artist of any quality, you probably will end up needing to have a school, because you probably will need to end up training the kind of artists you want to inhabit your work. And then, if you need a school, you need a space. So I am in the process of acquiring a space in the Gaeltacht here in West Kerry. It's a long and complicated process that I won't bore you with, but the dancers I work with, we have to train together for quite a long time before we can even begin to make the kind of work that I want to make with them. It's interesting about training, Declan, is that, and I learned a lot. I discovered that I was right in what I was sensing when I worked with the National Youth Dance Company of England. And the National Youth Dance Company of England is made up of people who haven't trained. I mean, they're pre-training, or they've trained but not really trained. And what they were capable of achieving was remarkable. When you work with dancers who've trained a lot, like dancers who are in their mid-20s or approaching 30, what you have to do with them is almost untrain them to do the kind of work that I like to do, which is more connected with natural movement and natural instincts and relationships with each other and with music. So training, you have to be cautious with it.
Well, it's such an interesting point you make. I remember a certain Irish poet, who shall be nameless for the moment, saying that the trouble with English poets was that at the age of 30, they achieved a technical proficiency that left them invulnerable to criticism and incapable of development. And that's kind of what you're saying, isn't it, about people unlearning learned responses about the dance?
Yes. What I hold dear is that I do believe that, a dancer, really this can apply to anyone, they're kind of remarkable in what they are from the moment, as you describe it, that they appear, and that often training annihilates or subjugates that sense of that unique and profound beauty that one person that you are, that's unique individuality that you come into the world with. And I think after training, or maybe beyond training, we seek to reconnect with that we train. You hear that cliche, you know, you need to forget the training, you know, you learn the training so you can forget it. It can be very difficult to forget it. It's almost more difficult to forget it than to learn it, from my experience.
Can I ask you about Yeats in this context? Because I know we share a great love of WB and an admiration for him. He tried to, I mean, he did set up a kind of abbey ballet school through Ninette de Valois and so on. And yes, he wrote at the end of his own life, 70 years have I lived, 70 years man and boy, and never have I danced with joy.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile this, that this poet who was obsessed with the image of the dancer and with plays for dancers, probably never even got up at a wedding and did the twist, you know?
Well, I don't know. How do you reconcile that? I suppose, like, there is this marked and this marked capacity that we have to separate the mind and the body, or the mind and the body and the spirit or the soul, or whatever words you want to describe our spiritual center or nature. And I think Yeats, like, you know, I am not an academic, but I am an instinctual person who walks the earth. And I feel, maybe from my limited understanding, that Yeats was sublimely gifted intellectually, and his capacity for thought and imagination was beyond my comprehension. But there are others who walk the earth who are like that, who maybe they're not William Butler Yeats, but this capacity for thought can create an obstacle for experience, for the visceral, for the real, for I say this because I've come across it a lot in the world where I worked in what we call high profile venues. I used to work a lot in opera, Declan. So I'd come across this kind of, I remember this man saying to me, they were considering me to be the director of this Rameau rock opera. And he said, they were interviewing me and they said, you know, Michael, he said, would you make the chorus dance, the singers, would you make them dance if you were the director? And I thought for a moment and I said, yes, but only if the dancers can sing. And he said, he went, oh, he said, no. He said, you know, singing takes training. And I thought that was a remarkable moment, in that there's something about dancing that we associate with the primitive, with the fool, or even with the profane, with the prostitute, with the idiot, you know, and therefore, you know, if you're a man of great sophistication and intellectual capability, it is something that you'll hold a long way away from you, and therefore maybe never get a chance to fully experience or ever experience. And I think there's something in that about Yeats, maybe. You get a feeling from Yeats, don't you, though, Declan, that he's yearning all the time for this experience.
Yeah, no, he's a man of words who would love to dance.
Yes.
And I've often thought about your art, because you began very much as a man of dance who moved a little bit closer and closer to words with each of your successive works. Isn't that true?
That's true to a point. I suppose I alternated a bit between the unspoken and the spoken. That's an interesting, one reason was, Declan, was that, like, in Ireland, we are the story masters. We are the masters of a good narrative. And from the very simple ability to tell a story about what happened to your mother down at the supermarket yesterday, and how you would know, how you can create the structure. So how we can create the structure so brilliantly and so immediately. You'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there'll be a point of pressure in the story and then a release. Like, I see that in Irish actors, which I have mixed feelings about, but they're the masters of timing, Irish actors. I've never seen actors who have the timing of an Irish actor, which in my view can make them a little bit sloppy and lazy in their training, because they're so good at one thing. They can have a whole career based on their timing. But what I'm trying to say is that I use story and writing in my work because it immediately made it accessible to the audience in Ireland. If you try to make a dance piece, which I have also done, the reaction is quite different more complex, and more, it can be very unsatisfying. So many people have said to me over the years, Michael, you're such a good writer. Why the hell don't you just write? It was like, why are you dancing? You're not very good at it. You're not very good at choreography. Why don't you just do it right, for God's sake? But I always felt that if I could get very good at the thing that was polar or opposite to the other thing, that it would bring me back there eventually. Now, I don't know yet if that will happen, but well, maybe you'll let me know one day that somehow I've got back to where I should be.
No, I think you have balanced the two, and it's just fascinating because you have come from the body and dance to the world of words, whereas most people do it in the opposite direction. Could I just ask you about the whole storytelling thing and the way in which you conceive each of your artworks? Do they begin with an image or an instinct? Because you're emphasizing very much the feeling person rather than the judgmental mind.
Yeah.
When you're creating a work, is that how it comes, as a feeling or an image or an instinct rather than something much more rational?
Well, I think, I think yes, but I think you need both. And I suppose everyone's different, but I think the judgmental mind is a tricky animal to have in the room with you. And I've been in the room with this particular animal, either in my own head or in the head of someone else that I had to work with. And I find my creativity diminishes in the presence of this character. Although without it, you can get extremely self-indulgent in your work. And, you can make 3-hour pieces where people roll around the floor in leaves. So I think a little bit of judgment is certainly a good thing, but maybe much later in the process. I think the closer you can get to the instinctual in the genesis of a work, ultimately the more, if I use the word powerful, would that be okay? Ultimately, the more powerful and far-reaching the work would become. I think a person who I'm studying a lot at the moment, and I'm beginning to get there with, is William Blake.
Yes.
And I think he comes to mind as well because I know William Butler Yeats was a fan of William Blake. So I figured if Yeats liked Blake, then Blake was probably all right, Declan, But yes. Blake talks a lot about that, connecting with the simple, with the animal, with the natural, as a means to connect with the truly profound, as opposed to the intellectual and the reasonable.
Yeah, and I mean, when I have seen your works and enjoyed them, I've often felt that they communicate with me, a bit like, say, when I first heard Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan, that the communication happens before it's understood.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That, like,
I know exactly what you mean.
Working at a gut level rather than, it's what Yeats called, in fact, the thinking of the body. And I think this is probably how you want people to receive your art. It's not just the way you imagine it yourself. It's also what probably should be happening in the audience.
Well, what's really interesting about it is that you don't know what you're doing for a lot of the time. And I mean, as I've got older, I begin to slowly understand what I'm doing, but probably maybe the best things I've ever done, I didn't know what I was doing when I was doing them, if that makes any sense. I remember reading a good quote from the Polish theater maker, Grotowski, and someone was describing being at the theater and watching work and having images unfold in their mind that were not necessarily related to what they were seeing, but somehow the order of the symbols or the energetic structure of the theatrical manifestation was unlocking things that were hidden in the very back of their brains. And I remember loving that idea. And I suppose then I became a bit suspicious about structured, linear, sensible theater. I thought the other thing sounds much more exciting. And, the potential of this feeling it before you've seen it, or it sounds to me, the way you describe it, it sounds a bit like magic, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah, it does. It really does. I mean, in that context, you have in the past, but not in the paragraphs you asked us to read for today, but let me bring you back to the past for a moment. Yeah, I've been very critical of ballet, I think, as a form of dance. And I remember you once even saying to me that, you know, people who teach it might end up getting sued by students for the damage that has been done. Are you still as strict a critic of ballet, or have you softened a bit in your attitude?
I probably am still a strict critic. I've learned maybe to keep my powder dry maybe a little bit as I've got older, because, you know, people, yeah, I trained, you see, I guess I trained as a ballet dancer for about 4 years, very intensely, Declan, like, but I was older. So I have firsthand experience of it. And I think it's pretty cruel, the training, and maybe especially on women.
Yeah.
And I wondered about that now. I wondered, it's a bit like eating, growing. I mean, I made the comparisons with growing organic vegetables as opposed to vegetables grown in a hothouse, you know, that they're much better for you when they're grown in the ground organically, in well-sourced, you know, horse manure, as opposed to grown in hydroponics in a glass house in the Netherlands. And I suppose ballet to me feels like that. It feels very, very forced and very, very cruel in order to achieve a superficial manifestation that is not sustainable, because people get really wrecked from it and retire early. And other people glory in that and think that's, well, you know, everything is transient and it's a manifestation of the I can't say that word.
Ephemeral.
Yes, nature of existence. But when you need a hip replacement at 39, you don't care about the transient nature of it. You know, it doesn't feel poetic. It just feels sore.
Yeah. I think Yeats probably realized that. You know that famous line, labor is dancing or blossoming where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul. That bruising is what you're talking about.
Yes.
And even Singh talked about meeting a group of dancers once on a train in France and being aware of how arduous and physically punishing their training was. Almost like that of overdeveloped super athletes, indeed.
Yes, yes. I think that it makes me think of, I love the idea of dancing into old age, or even to be more more poetic, dancing to death. And in order to do that, you need to be in fairly decent condition. And that what I noticed about some systems of training was that ultimately they were crippling people as opposed to liberating them. And that didn't make any sense to me. The other thing I don't like about ballet training is it all happens in front of a mirror.
Yes.
Which I discovered through time and work, that when you're preoccupied with the external manifestation of the self, when you're looking at yourself making shapes, you stop feeling. And when your capacity to feel is reduced, surely your capacity to be an artist or a communicator is also equally diminished.
But that's what D.H. Lawrence said about the corruption of sexuality in the modern world, that people had been reduced to watching themselves doing it in mirrors. And that was what had driven sex into the human head, where it should not solely or necessarily be.
I think D.H. Lawrence,
like a similar critique.
It's absolutely similar. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that's an amazing quote from D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah. And about all that, like we had discussions earlier in this series with Deirdre Mulrooney, among others, and also Ivana Lynch. And I asked them about the ballet thing, and they said, yes, your critique has many very telling points, but that a lot of even free American dance at the moment would incorporate a balletic element.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is perhaps even in river dance, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the paragraph you asked us to read, which is really interesting, mentions, you know, how you bang out a rhythm by the feet, that the feet are an engine and the hands are the expressors.
Yes.
That's not traditional Irish dancing, but it is a bit like river dance.
Well, I find that that quote and Irish dancing as we perceive it, very interesting bedfellows, because if the hands are the expressors of power and we hold them by our sides, what does that tell us? Like, I wondered, if you don't dance with your hands, you somehow have no power or no ability to express it. You know, dancing and fighting have parallels. And I think one of the great Greek philosophers, it might even have been Socrates, I'm not sure, but someone said the best dancers make the best warriors. Or it might have been the best warriors make the best dancers. And I think that should be true. I think great dancers should be great warriors. But if you don't know how to throw a spear or throw a punch, you won't be able to hold your own on the battlefield. And I think there is something about taking the power away from a dancer when you ask them not to move their hands. And I've had lots of experience around this because I've worked a lot with traditional Irish dancers, some of the greatest and finest, like Colin Dunn, or with some young Irish dancers. And I remember what comes to my mind, Declan, I was in Leitrim working with some young Sean-Nós dancers, and I was simply trying to get them to open their arms to what we call second position in the classical ballet vocabulary, which is to the sides. And when you open your arms to the side, your back opens and your heart opens up. And they found it so difficult to do. So
why do you think that is?
Well,
is it just the repression you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion?
Well, no, I think you need to practice. You need to practice opening up. It's not easy. You see, as a dancer, as an artist, as a performing artist, you need to learn how to walk in front of 1,000 people and open up. And that sounds relatively simple, doesn't it? But it's not so simple. And I think a lot of techniques that we use in the theater, including complex rhythms stamped out with the feet, hide or prevent the necessity to open up, because people are too busy looking at your feet and being impressed with how wonderful you are. So you've gone out, done a trick, and then come off the stage, but nothing really has happened.
Is that why? I mean, I know Irish dancing tapping is with the noisy heel of the shoe is part of it. But I remember in one of your works, everyone was barefoot. I think it was Swan Lake, was it?
Yeah.
Was that meant to be a kind of implied critique of Irish dancing?
No. But I think if there's something between your foot and the surface on which it relates to, there's a barrier, there's an obstacle. You can't feel the floor when there's a skin of cow leather between it and the floor. But I was reading recently, I'm reading this book about the 18th century Ireland, about deportation to Van Diemen's Land. And yes. I just last night I read this paragraph that said the prisoners were given shoes on the boats, and most of them had never seen or worn shoes in 1835.
Yes,
these were like the ribbon men, these agrarian undercover gangs that protected the peasants from the landlords, and they were given shoes on the boats, and they'd never worn shoes, and they found this extraordinary. So, like, the idea that we wear shoes is quite new anyway,
Well, it's kind of. I remember my wife Beth, who grew up in London in an Irish family that had emigrated, but they came home for 6 weeks every summer to Ballyhike in Kerry. And she said the first thing they did was take off their shoes. Nice. So they could run around the beach. And it reminded me actually of the line I quoted from Yeats about Helen of Troy, who doing a dance just impulsively, thinking no one is looking at her. She thinks part woman, 3 parts child, that nobody looks. Her feet practice a tinker shuffle, picked up on the street. Nice. That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting as well, Declan. The thing about what I discovered working with dancers is the difference between when a dancer is being watched and when they're not being watched. It is extremely, and this probably has connections with physics, you know, the way they say electrons behave differently when they're being watched to when they're not being watched. But dancers, it's very hard to dance when you're being watched by 1,000 people as if you're not being watched. And it is a beautiful thing to behold if you can get it to happen in a big theater with a lot of people watching, to watch someone like, as Yeats described Helen of Troy, dancing as if they're on their own. It really affects one to be witness to that. It's beautiful.
Well, the other beautiful image is, you know, that poem he wrote early on, to a child dancing in the wind. Dance there upon the shore, what need of you to care for wind or ocean's roar, that the salt drops have wet. Being young, you have not known the fool's triumph, nor yet love lost as young as soon as won, or the best laborer dead with all the sheaves to bind. What need of you to dread the monstrous crying of wind? But it's about a child unself-consciously dancing. And it's like you and I have seen kids in Clontarf, age 3, suddenly running forward for no apparent reason instead of walking. But that is the human body in action. Yeah. I think we should perhaps pause so that people can...
Yes, and I just before we break, I just wanted, I don't know, Michael, if you saw this, but there's this beautiful video that I think went viral of this Nigerian boy dancing ballet in the rain, barefoot. And it's bringing together what Declan just quoted and what you're saying about dancing barefoot, but and like without anyone watching. It's actually quite aesthetically beautiful to watch him dance.
Except I wish he wasn't doing ballet. Everything about it is beautiful, except he's making a vote. Yeah, you see, I associate ballet. God, I'm going to be very bold and say it's the dance language of the imperial army, of the emperors. It's not the dance language of an indigenous, healthy, sharing community of people. It's a long conversation, but to me, it's like the language of the emperor who comes and says, "Dance for me," you know.
Well, that's a very good question to get the breakout groups out with, actually. So maybe that's what we'll discuss, if you don't mind, Declan.
That's fine. Let it rip.
Okay, Zoe. So if you don't mind, Zoe, we'll break out into our groups, and I'll just ask that we do it a little shorter, Zoe. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I was in a breakout room and had a lovely discussion with Julian and Maddie and Diane. So thank you. Michael, one of our first questions, I think, goes to you with regards to, you know, having lived in Dublin and moving out to Dingle. And I think it draws a parallel to what we are like here in Keimer. What is it about a liminal space or being on a periphery that lends to your creative impulses? And why Dingle? Like, where is I understand the language is very key, but what is it about being in a liminal space that has lent itself to your creative impulse?
Well, I lived in the Midlands for 12 years. And that is also a kind of a liminal space for other reasons. I suppose, yeah, there's something about the extreme nature of the topography here. Everything is, the ocean is majestic. It's terrifying. And I didn't maybe know this before I moved here, but one thing that happened, I had a moment about a year into living here where I suddenly realized how small I was. And that sounds very obvious, but in the Midlands, everything is relatively close because it's flat and I don't know, there's trees and bushes, but here there's a sense that it's enormous. Like when you look out to the ocean from the mountain, when the ocean meets the sky and the sky meets the ocean and the ocean meets the mountain, it feels like it's endless. And there was something really terrifying about that moment, because I'd read about many people have described that discovery of the insignificant nature of your existence. and how important it is to come to terms with that. That's not to diminish the fact that it's also glorious to be alive and to be part of this, but you need to do the work in both directions. So there was something magnificent about that discovery, and that was the inspiration for the work that I made called Mom. Because a mom, you know, is a pass. A mom is shaped like a V, you know, and it's where you pass to cross to the other side of the valley. So they became sacred and important places because you needed to go that way. A mom also means obligation in Irish, which is interesting because my feeling was then you were obliged to go that way. So I think
we actually have a mom pass right beside us. So when you come to visit us, Michael, I'll take you on that mom pass here.
What's it called? Please
it's called Mom. It's mom. It's like Mom Main, but we call it the Mom Main pilgrimage. But very similar. And there's a pass between the two. So I'll take you on that. I'm going to follow up with a quick question again for you because Catherine's asked about how you balance freedom of expression and then the explicit, because we talked about this in our own stuff, how you balance the freedom of expression and the discipline of dance in your own work.
Oh, well, that's the $1 million question. How you balance it. You need to practice both. You need to practice discipline and you need to really get good at indiscipline. And you need to know when you're doing both. And you need to be sensitive to when you're doing one too much or one too little. And what's good about working with dancers, I suppose, is you have this representation in front of you. So you see you see in the dancer's face and in their demeanor and how they carry themselves in the space. If you're working with too much freedom or too much structure, but one without the other becomes really tedious and boring. So, I mean, that's the $1 million question. Great art has both in almost perfect harmony, I suppose.
Declan, this one I think is for you from Julian in South Bend. Could you talk a little bit about the role of collaboration between a dancer and a writer? I am thinking specifically about the collaboration between Michio Ito and Yeats at the Hawkswell. They could hardly communicate because of language barriers, and yet Yeats admitted that what Ito brought to the play made so much of the earlier draft redundant. How do we separate the dancer from the script?
Mm-hmm.
How can we tell the dancer from the dance? Well, I think Michael has sort of answered it already because, and he will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way he describes it, dance itself is also a language, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And it may be an even more direct, primeval, eloquent one than mere words. Remember what Oscar Wilde said, everybody is good until they learn how to talk. Because once you learn how to talk, you start telling lies. But if you look at a baby, a pre-talk baby, they are dancers, like Michael said, and they're utterly expressive. And this might be the moment for me to remember, Michael, when you were a little baby and I held you in my lap. And I knew you were going to be the great man you've become. But I think that the language of the body is anterior to utterance, really. And that's what Yeats was accepting. That even though he was perhaps the greatest poet in the language since Shakespeare, language is itself a flawed medium. It's full of imperfections. I'm not saying the body isn't either, but body's a bit closer.
This is from Maddie in Providence. It's a question for Michael. We have discussed in weeks past the unique way in which Irish culture has historically valued and integrated people with disabilities in Irish culture society, more so than in the US, for example. Has this, that is integrating disabled bodies, transferred to Irish dance culture as well? Why or why not? And what value might it bring?
I suppose the honest answer is I don't really know. What value it would bring it would definitely remind us and strengthen the idea amongst us that all manifestations of nature, of God, I'll use the word God, of all people, disabled, not disabled, man, woman, black, white, all manifestations of energy that manifest as humans are beautiful and curious and exciting and amazing. I haven't worked a lot with disabled dancers. I worked with one young man who had a serious brain injury, and he was extraordinarily brilliant. I've worked a little bit with people who with what they call Down syndrome, and they were brilliant dancers. In Swan Lake, there's a woman who's 85. There's also a woman who was 19. So I don't know if Ireland, if the Irish people have been better at integrating people with disabilities into dance or into the cultural fabric of our society more than others. I get the feeling they've been very good in England, actually.
But a lot of your work contains what might be called, in perverted commas, mental illness.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier the links between the dancer and the fool.
Yes.
And of course, the fool has special insights. I mentioned in an earlier program, Dina Ladia, that
Yes.
people who in uncivilized cultures are called mad, in Gaelic, we're seen as just closer to God.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that, Dina Ladia. I like to say touched by the hand of Dionysus,
Yeah.
Yes.
But it means that the very idea of disability is itself essentializing a difference rather than accepting the full continuum of the community.
Yeah,
people with all kinds of abilities.
Yes, absolutely. And some, yes, I couldn't agree more. You put it so well, Declan.
I think just with the time that we have left, there seems to be a lot of questions around kind of like Irish traditional, like the river dance, and I'm going to try to put them together. But I guess it's towards you, Michael, about how much of river dance or traditional Irish dance has been blended into your work, or how would your choreography, for example, change if American jazz was used as in comparison? And would this change still accomplish what your goals are from your work? So I guess it's a bit of the influence of Irish traditional dance and how it affects you.
I'd say the influence of Irish traditional music has been much more important to the work I have made, because some of the music was left, some of it was left relatively intact, whereas we lost a lot of our dances. In fact, the dances we call Irish traditional dancing is relatively new. Even the oldest are the oldest versions that we think are the oldest. A lot of it comes from United States of America. In fact, a lot of our music I discovered over the years went to America and came back from America and then became what we call Irish traditional music. But it's the music, some of the music. We had Sean O'Riordan. Sean O'Riordan for me was a very important person, and his son Pather, because I felt true. And then there's a fiddle player called Martin Hayes, and of course there's Cormac Begley. There are people in Ireland who still have a lineage, a bit like a Japanese no actor. They have a lineage that goes way back. There is no dancer like that in Ireland, as far as I know. But there are musical families and people who have access to this language that feels very old. And I think if you listen, if you're a choreographer like me and have a sensitive nature, if you listen carefully, it kind of tells you everything you need to know about how the dancing should be. So if I put on some American jazz, of course, it would be completely different. But that's, I mean, when you said American jazz, I had a little laugh inside, because I would never, and I don't mean to be in any way diminishing, or it's just, I know I would never choreograph to American jazz ever. It just wouldn't be something I would ever do. So I hope that answers the question in some way.
Well, the Begleys have said, Michael, that it's in their DNA. It's like it's been for generations. The
Yes,
music.
It is in their DNA. And I mean, I'm very friendly with the whole Begley clan. I have, yeah. And it's very smart. If you can, if anyone ever gets the opportunity to hang around or get close to some of these individuals who do have this thing in their DNA, I highly recommend it, because it does rub off you if you're prepared to be patient and listen.
I have to ask the last question from Catherine, because it's just such a great question, Declan. When Yeats writes, "Never have I danced for joy," could it be that if he ever did dance, he danced to express the opposite of joy, the fire in his head?
Well, of course, that poem is called Imitated from the Japanese, so we don't have to take it as a literal statement of Yeats. But yeah, I think the dancing was inside his own head. And it was really the fire of creation, which, you know, Michael mentioned Blake, Tiger, tiger, burning bright. The whole idea of the anvil on which sparks fly and art is created. I think Yeats, in his own way, made words dance, and that was perhaps enough. But I think those who can do it with the body at the same time, like Michael can, are very special, especially when they integrate it with music. And I just want to take this opportunity to say how proud I am to be Michael Keegan-Dolan's cousin. And I hope, I know how much he's achieved, but his greatest moments are still ahead of him.
Thank you, Declan.
Well, on that note, my sincerest thanks goes to Michael Keegan-Dolan and really all of our panelists who joined us in this series. Deirdre Mulrooney, whom I've seen in the sessions since hers. Thank you for joining, Deirdre. Ivana Lynch, Dr. Emer O'Connor, who all participated in Professor Declan Kybert's Understanding the Body Through the Works of Yeats and Joyce. I cannot say personally just how much a privilege and honor it has been to work with Declan, and stress the generosity of his time and work in producing these sessions. I do want to highlight a book that Declan wrote that I think would, if you all are looking for an additional reading to the series, Ulysses and Us, An Everyday Guide to Living. I think it's a wonderful read, and I would highly recommend it to you all. My sincerest gratitude does go to Declan. I cannot overstate it. He is a scholar and a gentleman who has always given so much of his time to his students, to his colleagues, and to really all his readers. He is a true listener, and he has gifted Ireland with his acumen and learning. I cannot stress how magnificent it has been, the contributions that he's given to this book club. And I would just say it's been an absolute gift to have you, Declan, this entire time. Okay. So please, if you can all virtually join me in applauding Professor Declan Kybert.
Michael is laughing because he knows the key to me is just total stage fright. Listen to the band's great record, Stage Fright, and you know all about what creates these moments.
Well, this is our last of this session. I do want to invite you all to just a cook along. I know there's a couple of you who've done this before with us. Chef David of Kymore Abbey is doing 2 more sessions, but I just thought I would highlight it today because he's doing scones in traditional Irish bread. And then he's also doing a recipe for Irish Christmas pudding. So I know there's a couple of you on here, Mary Hendrickson being one of them, who might enjoy the secrets to a truly traditional Irish Christmas pudding. So on that appetizing note, I'd like to thank you again to all who participated in the series. I look forward to seeing you again soon. I want you to stay safe, be well, and have a good evening. Slán.
Slán.